I am sick of little bits of wood falling into this gap of my table saw. So sick in fact that I decided to make this the sexiest zero clearance insert plate on the internet. Hi guys, I'm Jack and I have recently purchased the Dewalt table saw, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to make this insert plate for it.
Now you want to go ahead and start off by removing the throat plate that comes with the table saw. You can use this as a guide to make sure that you find a piece of wood the correct size. I'm going to put the sizes of the piece of wood that you will need on the screen here, and this is the minimum size that you can have. I'm using a piece that is 11 millimeters thick, but a 10 millimeter thick piece will also work if that's all that you have available. Now you want to go ahead and use the throat plate that comes with the table saw as a guide and mark that on your piece of wood. I needed to cut down both the thickness and the length. And one little trick that I did here is I actually removed the throat plate and positioned it in between the fence and the blade of the table saw, and then put it back in and then locked the fence down. I knew then that that would be the exact width that I needed to cut down my piece of wood to. And because the piece that I had was considerably longer than what it needed to be, just to make it easier to work with, I did go ahead and cut down just over what I actually needed. So again, I positioned that throat plate back on the piece of wood and used that to draw where I needed to curve off those edges so it would sit nicely. And then I used the cross sled that I built in another video, and I'll link to that in the description, to actually cut the length to the exact measurement. I then went over to my bandsaw, which was an absolute bargain. I got this for £25 at a car boot recently, and I can't believe how well it works. I used my bandsaw to actually cut down all of these corners and create a pretty good edge. If you do not have a bandsaw available, a jigsaw would work just as well here. Just be really careful when cutting this down. I would probably advise going a little bit outside of your pencil line as opposed to under it, because you can always sand off more and you could not add timber back on. As you can see, I got a pretty good fit. I was very happy with that. I put it in there just to position it, and it was sitting pretty snug in there. I did think it was a little bit tight, so I grabbed my sander and just sanded off those edges. And as you can see, that sits really nicely within there. The next thing you'll need to do is cut out the blade gap, and I did this by positioning that piece of wood in the insert and butting my fence right up to it. Then cut out the gap where the blade would need to go through, and this is where I noticed a slight problem. It didn't actually sit flat once I positioned it in there, and the reason for that is there is this slight curve next to the blade that actually sticks up, and I needed to figure out a way to tackle that. Now the best way I could figure out how was I put some paper on my table saw, put it down with tape and marked out exactly where that curve was, and then transferred that over to the piece of timber that I was making. I could then mark exactly where I needed to route out and grab my plunge router in order to remove some material that would allow this to sit perfectly flush with the top of my table saw. And as you can see, with that material removed, problem solved. It was now sitting very flush. One thing I did want to do was close the gap just to add strength, so I used my table saw to cut a very thin piece of timber out and then a little bit of wood glue to push that into the end here. And you want to make sure that you get this at the right width so it doesn't either increase or decrease the gap of where that blade is. Once the glue is dried, just cut off the excess and sand that down so you get a smooth edge again. I was finding it quite difficult to actually remove this once I pushed it into the insert, so I did go ahead and draw myself a finger hole, and this just allowed moving it in and out of the table saw a lot easier, so I recommend that you do the same. I then had to go in for some lunch, and I saw this as an opportunity to get the wood burner out and put on a nice message.
If you're enjoying this video so far, please smash the like button and consider subscribing for more videos like this.
Now one problem I did have that I wasn't expecting is upon raising the blade, it kept pushing the actual insert plate out, and that's obviously not good. You don't want that. And from what I could figure, it was these bits here were actually going to be necessary. So I used the original plate to mark up where these needed to stick out, and my plan was to use this router bit to remove some material. So I put my router bit in and raised it about 4 mil and used my handy router table that I built in another video here and removed the material that I needed to use to position this wood in here. I went in just over 1 inch on both marks, and be really careful not to go too far, and as you can see, that worked really well. I was then able to cut down 2 very small insert pieces that would be positioned within here. I then grabbed a little bit of wood glue, filled these up and pushed those down into there, and then clamped them securely and allowed them to dry for 30 minutes. I used the original plate to mark on exactly how much these needed to stick out, so it's about 10 mil, and used the table saw just to chop off any excess. As you can see, this solved the problem and I was now able to raise and lower the blade. I did want to just remove the excess here, so I grabbed some rough grit sandpaper and shave that down to be level with the actual board. The last step here is to actually position the screws into the board, and these allow you to raise the height of the insert plate. As you can see, there are 4 that I needed to mark, so I grabbed some orange paint and put very small blobs exactly where these screws needed to appear. I then pushed my insert plate into the gap and pressed down firmly. Now this transferred orange paint onto the back of my insert plate, and I was then able to mark out exactly where these screws needed to be drilled. From the back side, I drilled a hole and then flipped it over so I could countersink each of them. And the countersink that I actually opted to use wasn't wide enough for these screws that I've decided to use. And that is a good point. You do not have to use other screws. You can use the original screws from the Dewalt's insert plate. That's entirely up to you. I didn't want the hassle of switching these out every time, so I grabbed new ones. I then pushed these in, and as you can see, that worked really well. I was then able to adjust all of these so they sat perfectly level with the top of the table saw. And that worked really well. This is now all done. I really recommend that you create yourself one of these. As you can see, sitting perfectly level with the top of the table saw. I can now make perfect 90-degree cuts without the risk of anything falling down into the blade, and I've also avoided any tear out that was happening with the original insert plate.
Thanks, and if you liked this video, I recommend checking out this router table extension I made for the Dewalt table saw next.